Start my father's Ferrari, and I'll give you half the company." Victoria Sinclair said it with a smile that made the entire room laugh. They weren't laughing with me. They were laughing at me. All they saw was a black single dad in a grease-stained work shirt standing inside a billionaire's private garage beside a Ferrari worth more than everything I owned combined. What they didn't see was the tiny brass key hidden behind a dusty fuse panel. A key that looked like it belonged in a junk drawer, not inside one of the rarest cars in America. I didn't know it then, but that $9 key was about to expose a secret worth hundreds of millions. But before I tell you what happened when I turned it, you need to understand why I almost walked away. If you're watching from somewhere in the world tonight, tell me where you're from and what time it is there. And if you enjoy stories about dignity, family, and ordinary people proving everyone wrong, subscribe and stay with me until the end. Trust me, this Ferrari wasn't broken. It was keeping a secret. My name is Marcus Reed. I'm 44 years old, a black single dad, and the owner of a one-bay restoration garage on the edge of Indianapolis. Most people drive past my place without noticing it. The paint is faded. The sign hangs a little crooked. And on rainy days, water still finds its way through a crack in the roof that I've been meaning to fix for 3 years. But inside that garage, I've spent my entire life working with my hands. Classic Ferraris, old Porsches, Bentleys that rich people forgot they owned until they suddenly remembered they were valuable again. If it has an engine and a story, I've probably worked on it. Above the garage sits a small apartment where my son Elijah and I live. He's 11. Smart. Curious. The kind of kid who asks questions most adults never think to ask. Ever since his mother passed away 5 years ago after a battle with cancer, it's been just the two of us. Every morning starts the same way. Coffee for me, cereal for him. Then we walk downstairs together and open the garage. Some fathers teach baseball, some teach fishing. I teach engines. Elijah can identify most Ferrari models faster than many collectors. Not because he's obsessed with money, because he loves figuring out how things work. Truthfully, so do I. That's probably why losing my old career hurt so much. 15 years ago, I was one of the lead restoration specialists for a prestigious collector group. We worked on museum-level vehicles worth millions. Then a failed investment scheme inside the company collapsed. A few executives protected themselves. A few workers became convenient scapegoats. I wasn't charged with anything. I wasn't guilty. But when your name gets dragged through headlines, innocence doesn't always matter. The wealthy collectors disappeared. The contracts disappeared. Most of my professional reputation disappeared with them. So I opened my own garage and started over. Slowly. Painfully. One customer at a time. I never became rich, but I kept something more important. My dignity. And every night when Elijah finished his homework at the little desk beside my workbench, I reminded myself why that mattered. Because my child was watching. The week everything changed started like any other. Business was slow. 2 customer cars were late on payments. The electric bill sat unopened on my desk. I was underneath a vintage Porsche replacing fuel lines when Elijah walked in carrying an old red Ferrari model car. The paint was chipped. One wheel was missing. It had belonged to his grandfather. "Dad," he asked, holding it up. "Why do people keep things that don't work anymore?" I smiled without looking up. "Because sometimes the thing isn't broken," I said. "Sometimes it's waiting for the right person to understand it." At the time, I thought we were talking about a toy car. 3 days later, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed a name that every mechanic in America would recognize. Sinclair Estate. And by the time that call ended, My son and I were about to step into a world where billionaires, Ferraris, and old family secrets were about to collide in a way neither of us could have imagined. 3 days after that phone call, Elijah and I drove through gates that looked expensive enough to have their own zip code. The Sinclair estate sat on nearly 40 acres outside the city. Stone walls, iron fences, perfect landscaping. The kind of place built to remind visitors exactly how much money they didn't have. My old pickup truck looked completely out of place among the Bentleys. Rolls-Royces and black executive SUVs parked near the main house. Elijah noticed it too. "Dad," he whispered as we stepped out, "I think our truck is the poorest vehicle here." I laughed. "Good thing trucks don't care." He grinned. That grin didn't last long. The moment we entered the private garage, I felt every eye in the room shift toward us. Collectors, lawyers, executives, family advisors, people wearing watches that cost more than my entire yearly income. And standing at the center of all of them was Victoria Sinclair, 39 years old, CEO, billionaire. Only daughter of the late Richard Sinclair. She was dressed in a tailored white suit that probably cost more than my truck. When she looked at me, it wasn't openly rude. It was worse. It was the look wealthy people sometimes give working men when they're trying to decide whether you're the mechanic or the delivery driver. "You must be Marcus Reed," she said. No handshake, no smile. Just an evaluation. I nodded. "You called." Her eyes moved briefly to my work boots, then to my son, then back to me. "I've been told you're good with impossible Ferraris." "I've been told a lot of things." A few people chuckled. Victoria didn't. She simply turned and pointed toward the center platform. That's when I saw it. A 1963 Ferrari 250 GTO. Deep red. Perfect paint. Museum quality. One of the rarest cars on Earth. The rooms seemed to orbit around it. "My father loved this car more than anything he owned," Victoria said. "He restored it personally." I walked closer. The Ferrari looked beautiful, but something felt wrong. Not mechanically, emotionally, as if the car had been frozen in time. Nobody had touched it in years. Victoria crossed her arms. 23 specialists have examined it. 23. And none could start it. No. I looked through the glass toward the engine bay. Interesting. Very interesting. One of the attorneys stepped forward. "If anyone starts it, ownership control of several trust assets activates automatically." I turned toward him. "What does that mean?" "It means my father attached certain legal instructions to the vehicle." Now I had everyone's attention. Victoria sighed. My father was eccentric. Eccentric billionaires usually are. That earned a few laughs. Her expression remained cold. Then she said the sentence that made the entire room smile. "If you start it, Mr. Reed, I'll give you half the company." The room laughed. Not because they thought she meant it, because they thought the idea was ridiculous. A black mechanic from a small garage. A billionaire empire. The joke wrote itself. I looked over at Elijah. My son wasn't laughing. He was watching me. The same way children always do when they sense something important is happening. I turned back toward Victoria. "I'm not here for your company." "Then what are you here for?" I looked directly at the Ferrari. "To find out what this car is trying to tell us." For the first time all afternoon, Victoria looked genuinely confused, and 10 minutes later, I would discover the first clue that proved the Ferrari wasn't broken at all. The moment the crowd drifted away, I got my first chance to examine the Ferrari properly. Most of the executives lost interest almost immediately. That told me something. They weren't actually interested in solving the problem. They were interested in witnessing a spectacle, a rich family's mystery, a mechanic's failure. Either outcome would entertain them. I opened the driver's door and carefully slid into the seat. The smell hit me first. Old leather, machine oil, dust, and something else. Something strangely preserved. It felt less like sitting inside a car and more like stepping into a time capsule. Richard Sinclair had died almost 4 years earlier, yet nothing inside the Ferrari appeared disturbed. Not the seat position, not the gauges, not even the small notebook tucked inside the door pocket. I didn't touch it. Not yet. Elijah stood nearby, watching quietly. Victoria remained across the garage with her attorneys, watching me, evaluating me, waiting for me to fail. I began checking the basics. Battery, fuel delivery, electrical system, ignition. Everything appeared functional. That was the first thing that bothered me. Machines rarely lie. When something doesn't start, there's usually a reason. A broken part, a damaged wire, a failed sensor. But this Ferrari showed none of those signs. It was almost too perfect. I connected diagnostic equipment. Nothing unusual. I checked compression. Excellent. Fuel pressure. Excellent. Spark. Perfect. By every measurable standard, the engine should have started immediately. Yet it didn't. The other specialists found the same thing. Victoria's voice came from behind me. I glanced up. She was standing closer now, arms crossed, expression skeptical. 23 experts all failed, she said. What makes you think you'll be different? I shrugged. I don't. That answer surprised her. Most people in situations like this try to sound impressive. I never learned how. I just know cars, I said. And this one is behaving strangely. Her eyes narrowed. What does that mean? I looked around the garage, at the Ferrari, at the display photographs, at the old trophies lining the walls. Then I noticed something unusual. Every picture showed Richard Sinclair working on this Ferrari himself. Not mechanics. Not assistants. Him. Hands dirty. Tools in hand. Smiling. Proud. Almost protective. The kind of look fathers get when they're building something meant to last longer than they do. That detail stayed with me, because suddenly the car stopped feeling like a machine. It felt personal. As if Richard Sinclair had left something unfinished. Or hidden. Meanwhile, Elijah had wandered toward a display case. "Dad," he called, "look at this." I walked over. Inside the glass sat dozens of awards, photographs, old racing memorabilia, and one faded picture of Richard Sinclair standing beside a teenage Victoria, both smiling, both holding the same Ferrari. Neither looked particularly happy about the camera, but they looked happy with each other. Interesting. Very interesting. Families leave clues everywhere, sometimes in documents, sometimes in conversations, sometimes in machines. I returned to the Ferrari and removed a lower access panel near the driver's side fuse compartment. A simple inspection. Nothing dramatic. But the moment the panel came loose, something small dropped onto the floor. A metallic sound echoed through the garage. Clink. Everyone turned. I bent down and picked it up. At first glance, it looked worthless. Just a tiny brass key, old, scratched, ordinary. But the second I turned it over in my hand, I realized something. This key didn't belong to the Ferrari, and somehow, after 4 years and 23 specialists, nobody else had noticed it. For a few seconds, the entire garage stared at the tiny brass key sitting in my palm. Then most of them lost interest. That didn't surprise me. People tend to ignore small things when they're surrounded by expensive ones. A rare Ferrari commands attention. A scratched brass key does not. But I had spent my entire life fixing machines, and machines teach you an important lesson. The smallest part is often the most important. I turned the key over carefully. It was old, very old. Not decorative, not collectible, not valuable, at least not in the way billionaires usually measure value. There were scratches along the sides, wear marks around the teeth. Someone had used it regularly for years. More importantly, it carried a small engraving, just 3 letters. R.S. Richard Sinclair. The room suddenly became quieter. Victoria stepped closer. That belonged to my father. I don't know, I said, but those initials aren't an accident. One of the attorneys adjusted his glasses. None of the previous specialists reported finding a key. I looked back at the open fuse compartment. Because they weren't looking for one. That answer didn't make everyone happy. Several of the executives exchanged uncomfortable looks, the kind of look people share when a stranger starts noticing things they missed. I slipped the key into my pocket. Immediately, Victoria objected. I'd rather you leave that here. I met her eyes. Then tell me where it belongs. She couldn't. Neither could anyone else. That was the problem. The key clearly mattered, but nobody knew why. Elijah had been unusually quiet through all of this. Then he spoke. Dad. I turned. What is it? He pointed toward the Ferrari. If Mr. Sinclair hid the key inside the car. Maybe he wanted someone fixing the car to find it. A few people smiled politely. The way adults smile when they assume a child is guessing. I didn't smile. Because the kid had a point. Children sometimes see the obvious thing adults overlook. I walked slowly around the Ferrari again. This time I wasn't examining an engine. I was examining a message. Because that's what the car was beginning to feel like. A message left by a father. Every detail suddenly looked different. The untouched notebook, the preserved garage, the hidden key, the legal instructions attached to the car. None of it felt random anymore. I stopped beside one of the framed photographs on the wall. Richard Sinclair stood next to the Ferrari with grease on his hands, and hanging from his belt loop was something familiar. A small brass key, the same shape. The same size, the same design. I felt a chill move through me. Not because of the key, because of what it suggested. This wasn't an accident. Richard Sinclair had hidden that key intentionally, which meant he wanted someone to find it. But not immediately. Not after a month. Not after a year. After 4 years. That raised a much bigger question. What was so important that a billionaire would hide it inside the one machine he trusted more than most people around him? I looked down at the key again. And for the first time, I noticed a tiny number stamped near its base. 7. Just a single number. Small enough that almost anyone would miss it. But something told me that number was about to change everything. The number 7 stayed in my mind for the rest of the afternoon. Most people in that garage assumed it was random. I didn't. Nothing about Richard Sinclair felt random anymore. Not the Ferrari, not the hidden key, not the legal instructions attached to the car. and certainly not a tiny number stamped where almost nobody would ever notice it. I asked Victoria a simple question. How many garages are on this property? She looked surprised. 3. I shook my head. Not buildings. Workspaces. She thought for a moment, then pointed through the large glass windows overlooking the estate. My father had 7. That got my attention. 7. The same number stamped on the key. Interesting. Very interesting. I asked if they still existed. They've been locked since he died, she said. Nobody uses them. One of the executives laughed softly. You don't seriously think this key opens a garage door? No, I said. I think it opens something inside one. The laughter disappeared, because suddenly that sounded possible. Victoria checked her watch. Clearly, she wasn't thrilled about spending her afternoon following theories from a mechanic. But curiosity is powerful. Even billionaires aren't immune to it. An hour later, a small group of us crossed the estate. Me, Elijah, Victoria, 2 attorneys, and a security director who looked like he expected trouble. The 7th workshop sat furthest from the mansion. Unlike the others, it wasn't polished or restored. It looked forgotten. Dust covered the windows. Vines crawled across the stone walls. The building felt strangely untouched, as though someone had intentionally left it frozen in time. Elijah stared at it. It looks like a secret hideout. Honestly, it did. Victoria unlocked the main door. The hinges groaned as it opened. Dust floated through the afternoon sunlight. Inside sat old tools, engine stands, blueprints, shelves full of parts. Everything exactly where Richard Sinclair had left it. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The room felt personal. Not billionaire personal. Father personal. The kind of place where a man escaped when he wanted to be himself instead of what the world expected. I slowly walked through the workshop. Photographs covered one wall. Many included a young Victoria. Others showed race cars. Friends. Family. Memories. Then I noticed something strange. A wooden tool cabinet stood in the corner. 7 drawers, each numbered. The 7th drawer had no handle, only a small brass keyhole. My pulse quickened. The room suddenly felt much smaller. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the tiny brass key. The security director stepped forward. Maybe we should wait. Victoria raised her hand. No. Her voice was softer now. Different. For the first time, this wasn't about the company. It was about her father. I inserted the key. Perfect fit. The mechanism clicked immediately. Nobody breathed. Slowly, I pulled open the drawer. Inside wasn't money, not jewelry, not stock certificates. Instead, there was a weathered black notebook, a sealed envelope, and a single handwritten note resting on top. The note contained only 6 words. For Victoria, when the truth becomes necessary. And at that exact moment, I realized this Ferrari mystery was never about starting an engine. It was about exposing something Richard Sinclair had been trying to protect for years. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The entire workshop seemed to hold its breath as Victoria stared at the envelope addressed to her. For Victoria, when the truth becomes necessary, the words hung in the air. Slowly, she picked up the envelope. Her hands were steady. Her eyes weren't. I noticed that immediately. because for the first time since I'd arrived at the estate, she no longer looked like a billionaire CEO. She looked like a daughter. Just a daughter. The attorneys exchanged nervous glances. One of them stepped forward. Perhaps we should review any documents before opening them. Victoria didn't even look at him. No. The answer came instantly. Sharp. Final. She broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter, several folded pages, and beneath it sat the weathered black notebook. I watched her begin reading. At first, her expression didn't change. Then it did. Confusion, disbelief, shock. By the second page, the color had drained from her face. "What is it?" one attorney asked. Victoria didn't answer. Instead, she handed him the pages. The man began reading. 10 seconds later, he looked like someone had punched him in the stomach. That got everyone's attention, including mine. "What did Richard leave?" I asked quietly. Victoria swallowed hard. "My father knew." "Knew what?" She looked directly at me. "He knew someone inside the company was stealing from us." The room froze. The security director straightened immediately. One attorney lowered the pages and whispered a curse under his breath. Victoria opened the black notebook. Page after page contained records, dates, transactions, account numbers, handwritten observations, names. Richard Sinclair had spent years documenting financial theft inside his own company. He had built a complete case, and apparently never revealed it. At least not publicly. Then I understood something. The Ferrari, the key, the hidden drawer, the letter. This had never been a treasure hunt. It was a safeguard. Richard Sinclair had hidden the evidence where only the right person would find it. Not an executive, not a lawyer, not a board member, a mechanic, someone willing to take the car apart, someone willing to look closer, someone patient enough to notice a tiny clue. "The car was trying to tell us something," Elijah said softly. Nobody laughed, because he was right. Victoria kept turning pages. Then she suddenly stopped. One name appeared over and over again, a senior executive, a man currently serving as the company's chief financial officer, the same man who had attended the estate meeting that morning, the same man who had quietly left an hour earlier. I felt the shift instantly. The room's energy changed. This wasn't history anymore. This was happening now. The theft wasn't ancient. According to Richard's notes, millions of dollars had continued disappearing even after his death, which meant the betrayal never stopped. Victoria looked up from the notebook. Her eyes were filled with something I hadn't seen before. Not arrogance, not confidence. Pain. Real pain. "My father knew nobody would believe him," she whispered. Then she looked at the tiny brass key still sitting in my hand. A $9 piece of metal. Scratched. Ordinary. Invisible. And yet somehow it had unlocked a secret worth hundreds of millions. But the biggest surprise wasn't inside the notebook. It was hidden in the final page, because there, written beneath all the financial records, was a message addressed directly to Victoria. And after she read it, everything changed. I will never forget the look on Victoria Sinclair's face as she read the final page. The workshop had gone completely silent. Outside, the late afternoon sun was beginning to fade through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the old tools and workbenches. Inside, nobody moved. Victoria stared at the page for nearly a full minute before lowering it. Then she closed her eyes. Just for a second. When she opened them again, She looked older somehow. Not physically, emotionally. Like someone who had just discovered that the person they trusted most had been carrying a burden alone for years. "What did he say?" I asked quietly. Victoria swallowed. "My father knew he was dying." Nobody spoke. She looked down at the notebook. "He wrote that he couldn't prove everything before his illness got worse." Her voice trembled slightly. "So he created a backup plan." The attorneys exchanged grim looks. Victoria continued. "He wrote that if I was reading this, it meant the company was no longer safe." The words hit the room like a hammer, because everyone understood what that meant. Richard Sinclair hadn't hidden evidence to protect his fortune. He had hidden it to protect his daughter. The Ferrari. The key. The workshop. Everything had been part of a promise from a father who knew he might not be there when the truth finally surfaced. Then Victoria looked directly at me. For the first time all day, there was no arrogance in her eyes, no distance, no billionaire confidence, only gratitude, and maybe a little shame. "You found what 23 experts missed," I shrugged. "I found a key. You found my father." That landed harder than I expected. A few moments later, one of the attorneys stepped aside to make several urgent phone calls. The security director was already coordinating an investigation. The company would survive. The evidence was overwhelming. The executive responsible would eventually face consequences. But before any of that happened, Victoria surprised me. "Marcus," she said. I looked up. "I owe you something." I already knew where this was going, and I didn't like it. "You don't owe me anything." "That's not true." She stepped closer. "My offer still stands." Several heads turned. The room suddenly became very interested again. Victoria took a breath. "Half the company. A board position. Whatever resources you need, name it." There it was. The life-changing moment. The kind people dream about. The kind that could erase every financial struggle Elijah and I had ever faced. For a second, I thought about the electric bills, the mortgage, the garage roof, the future. Then I looked across the room. My son was standing beside the old Ferrari model car he'd been carrying all day, watching me, waiting, learning. My child was watching. And suddenly, the answer became very simple. I smiled politely. "Victoria, I appreciate it, but I'm not here for the money." The room went quiet again. "I came to fix a car." She stared at me. "That's all?" I shook my head. "No." Then I looked toward the notebook. "I came to help a father keep a promise." And judging by the expression on her face, that answer meant more to her than any business deal ever could. But what happened the next morning would change both of our lives far more than either of us expected. The next morning, the Sinclair estate looked completely different. Not because the buildings had changed, because the people had. Word had spread fast. The company's board had spent most of the night reviewing the evidence hidden inside Richard Sinclair's notebook. By sunrise, emergency meetings were already underway. Law firms had been contacted, federal investigators had been notified, and the executive whose name appeared throughout the records had quietly disappeared. At least for a few hours. By noon, security officers escorted him from corporate headquarters. The news channels picked up the story before dinner. Millions of dollars in hidden financial transfers. Years of deception. A billionaire company's biggest internal scandal. And it all started with a tiny brass key most people would have thrown into a junk drawer. But strangely enough, none of that was what stayed with me. The thing I remember most happened back in the garage. Victoria had asked me to return one final time. When Elijah and I arrived, the Ferrari sat exactly where it always had. silent, waiting. Only now the atmosphere felt different, lighter, as though some invisible weight had finally been removed. Victoria stood beside the car holding her father's notebook. She looked exhausted, but peaceful. "There's one thing left," she said. I nodded. The Ferrari. For 4 years, nobody had started it. Not because the engine was damaged. Not because parts were missing, but because Richard Sinclair had intentionally disabled one tiny component. A hidden fuel shutoff switch. Simple, elegant, almost impossible to find unless someone knew exactly where to look. A final lock protecting everything he had hidden. The moment I discovered it, I actually laughed. 23 specialists, millions of dollars spent, years of confusion, and the solution came down to a tiny mechanical part worth less than a family dinner. Sometimes that's how life works. The biggest problems hide behind the smallest things. I reached inside the engine compartment, made one adjustment, checked the connections, then stepped back. Everyone watched. Attorneys, board members, family friends, even several employees who had worked for Richard Sinclair for decades. Victoria looked at me. Ready. I smiled. "Let's see what your father wanted us to hear." I turned the key. The starter engaged. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the Ferrari came alive. The engine roared through the garage like it had been waiting 4 years to speak. The sound echoed off the walls. Deep, powerful, beautiful. Several people started crying immediately, including Victoria. She covered her mouth with both hands. Not because of the car, because it felt like hearing her father's voice again. The Ferrari idled perfectly, smooth, confident, alive, and standing beside me. Elijah grinned so hard I thought his face might split. "Dad," he whispered, "you fixed it." I shook my head. "No, buddy." Then I looked at Victoria, and at the notebook, and at the tiny brass key resting on the workbench. "I think your grandfather fixed it years ago." For the first time since I had met her, Victoria smiled without any walls around it. A real smile. And in that moment, the billionaire finally saw what she'd missed from the beginning. Not every working man walks into a room looking for money. Some are simply there to do what is right. But what happened afterward mattered far more than the Ferrari ever could. A month later, life looked surprisingly normal, which, if I'm being honest, was exactly how I wanted it. The news cycle had already moved on. The financial investigation continued. The executive responsible for the fraud was facing charges. Sinclair Industries survived. And Victoria Sinclair had done something I never expected. She kept her word. Not about giving me half the company. I never accepted that. Instead, she created something much better. A permanent technical scholarship fund for the children of mechanics, fabricators, welders, diesel technicians, and skilled trades workers. No giant press conference, no publicity campaign, no oversized check for photographers, just action, the kind Richard Sinclair probably would have respected. One afternoon, a package arrived at my garage. Inside was the tiny brass key, the original, along with a short handwritten note from Victoria. It read, "My father trusted the right person to find it. So do I. Thank you." That key hangs in my garage today. Not because it's valuable, because it reminds me of something. The world is full of people searching for big answers, big opportunities, big fortunes, big victories. And sometimes the thing that changes everything is a small clue nobody else thought was worth noticing. The funny part is that Elijah understands that lesson better than most adults. A few days after the package arrived, I found him sitting at the workbench. His grandfather's old Ferrari model sat in front of him. The missing wheel had finally been repaired. Beside it hung the brass key. The two objects looked strangely perfect together. One toy. One key. Two reminders that appearances rarely tell the whole story. "Dad," Elijah asked. "Yeah." "Buddy, why didn't you take the money?" I smiled. I'd been wondering when that question would come. Because 11-year-old boys are many things. Patient is usually not one of them. I sat beside him. "Do you remember what you asked me before all this started?" He thought for a second, then nodded. "The thing about broken stuff." "That's right." I pointed toward the Ferrari model. "Some things are worth fixing." Then I pointed toward the key. "And some things are worth protecting." He considered that quietly. Then he asked the question that mattered. "So what were you protecting?" I looked around the garage, at the tools, the workbenches, the little apartment upstairs, the life we'd built. Then I looked at my son. "You." His eyes widened slightly. I continued. "My child was watching. Every choice I made. You were watching. If I taught you that everything has a price, then eventually somebody would convince you to sell something that shouldn't be for sale." He nodded slowly. The way kids do when they're filing something important away for later. That night, after we closed the garage, I looked once more at the brass key hanging above the workbench. The Ferrari wasn't the real mystery. The company wasn't the real mystery. The real mystery was whether people would choose integrity when nobody could force them to. And maybe that's what Richard Sinclair had been testing all along. Not mechanics. Character. Because the most important things you'll ever fix aren't under a hood. They're inside a family. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated because of your job, your background, or the way people saw you at first glance? Have you ever said no to something everyone else thought you should take? Or discovered that one small detail completely changed your understanding of a person or a situation? Share your story below. I read as many comments as I can, and some of the best conversations happen there. And if you believe that dignity matters, that skilled working people deserve respect, and that the greatest wealth in life is often found in family rather than fortune, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us for the next story. Until next time, take care of the people you love and never ignore the small things. Sometimes they're trying to tell you something.